there, my name is Katie Morgan. I am an indie fantasy author and occasional fiction editor, and welcome to the first video in my new series on writing advice. Kind of. You may remember a video I did a while back on how annoyed I get with writing advice because it's usually either super prescriptive or it's just kind of tone deaf because what works for one writer doesn't necessarily work for another. Writing advice can also be kind of frustrating because sometimes it feels like it exists outside of context, like all those lists about things you should always do or things you should never do. This series is my attempt at a fix for that frustration. We're going to be discussing the craft of writing by looking at how other people are using it and stealing all their good ideas and hopefully avoiding their mistakes. And we're going to do that by talking about anime. Probably a lot of anime. I love geeky things, and even more than that, I love using geeky things to make me a better writer. And I thought other folks might feel that way, so here we are. For this inaugural episode, we are going to be talking about the anime Tower of God. But first, a little bit of housekeeping. For the purposes of this video, we're going to be focusing primarily on the first season of the anime. Yes, I know it's based on a much longer and still ongoing manhwa or Korean comic, so we're limiting ourselves a little bit by only talking about one portion of the story. But I'm a fan of YouTube videos that don't actually go forever, so I think we'll find plenty to talk about just within the first season. On that note, there will be spoilers for all 13 episodes of the Tower of God anime. And just to be safe, I'm going to throw in a spoiler warning for the first season of the manhwa as well. Like I mentioned, we're mostly going to be talking about the anime, but I am bringing in a few manhwa points, so better safe than sorry. I will do my absolute best to refrain from spoilers for anything past that, especially since it sounds like we are going to be getting a second season of the anime, so there will be plenty of time to talk about the rest of the story. Alright, now that all that's out of the way, let's get into the story. Story. Tower of God is an anime adaptation of an ongoing manhwa, or Korean comic, of the same name. The manhwa was created by artist SIU and began its run back in 2010. The anime was released in 2020. The story follows a boy named Bam, whose only memories are of being trapped alone in a dark cave until a girl named Rachel finds him. Rachel quickly becomes the most important person in Bam's life. Well, basically the only person in his life, and the one who teaches him everything he knows. So it's understandable that Bam is devastated when Rachel tells him she's leaving to go climb the tower, a magical place that is supposed to grant you whatever you wish for if you can reach the top. Rachel wants to escape the dark and see the stars, so she goes to the tower and tells Bam not to follow her. Which of course means that Bam immediately follows her. Bam's only interest in entering the tower is to be reunited with Rachel, but right off the bat he's faced with a plethora of challenges, including unruly legendary weapons, sketchy compatriots, and dangerous tests. Oh, and then there's the little problem of him being able to do things that normal people, or regulars, who enter the tower should not be able to do. And that last thing may very well get him killed. In this video, we're going to take a look at 3 different story elements and try to pick apart why they're working or not working and what we can take away that might help with our own writing. The elements we're going to address are genre, characters, and consequences. Genre. Genre is hugely important when it comes to writing and audience expectations, so let's start there. Structure. Tower of God is a shonen anime, which basically means that it's targeted at boys, shonen being the Japanese word for boy. That's a pretty big oversimplification though, because shonen appeals to people of many ages and many genders. And while strictly speaking, shonen is more of a category umbrella with lots of genres underneath, there are certain story structures and tropes that tend to go with shonen as a whole. In most shonen anime, you've got your action-adventure plotline featuring a young male protagonist who must team up with some plucky compatriots, often forming a main trio with very different personalities and narrative functions, with the goal of learning a bunch of skills and/or passing a bunch of tests to achieve a particular goal, beat the big bad, etc. As you can see, Tower of God fits pretty squarely under the shonen umbrella in the fantasy genre. This is important to consider from a writing perspective because I think sometimes there's this idea that writing to genre is bad or lazy. But you're actually doing yourself and your readers a big favor if you can get clear on your genre and its typical tropes, because that's a really great way of drawing the right people into your story. People tend to know what they're looking for, so if you can say, hey, here it is, then you're more likely to find those really engaged fans. For example, if I say that TOG is an anime with cool fights and intricate world building and a very, very twisty plot, that's going to pull in people who enjoy shonen anime with those traits. Which is not to say you can't subvert genre expectations. I would argue that this is something Tower of God does really well in the first season by really focusing on characters. The action sequences are all really important, but it's more about how those things affect the characters and their histories and their relationships with each other. There's a reason why most of this video is about the character aspects of the show. Exposition. One thing that shonen anime often struggles with, and honestly a lot of fantasy struggles with this, is the overuse of exposition to explain world building. As a story with massive amounts of world building, Tower of God understandably has a lot of things to explain. Unfortunately, this sometimes leads to situations where all of the action stops so that character A can explain something to character B. And character B is usually Bam because he knows less about the tower than basically everybody else. A certain amount of this is unavoidable and expected. It can even be done cleverly, like in episode 8, where Test Administrator Quant essentially gives a lesson in the middle of a fight. But you also get scenes like the one in episode 2, where Test Administrator Leidoro explains Shinsu, a magical substance used to fight in the tower, to a group of regulars, aka people who've lived in the tower their entire lives and probably already know this. The challenge here is that there are only so many variations you can do on the clueless main character asking a question, followed by someone explaining it to them, and by extension to the audience. So how do you explain stuff without being super awkward about it? Unfortunately, there isn't really a quick and easy answer to this, especially since it's kind of subjective. You can try having your designated arrogant smart character be the one who explains things, because at least then there's a good reason for the frequent monologuing. You can also have a setting that lends itself well to world-building explanations. For example, we spend most of Season 1 of TOG in what is essentially a training space, so it makes sense to have test administrators explaining things all the time. Although, if you have these explanations always begin with "the rules are simple," followed by rules that are anything but simple, you may try your audience's patience, or amuse them, your mileage may vary. When used well, exposition can be a great way to provide the info needed to navigate your world, but it can tip over into awkward pretty quickly, so use with caution. Writing takeaways on genre. 1. Don't be afraid to embrace your genre and play up its popular tropes. Your readers are here because they're looking for a specific character archetype or story structure, so why not give it to them? 2. That said, you should also be willing to subvert or adjust genre expectations where appropriate. You don't want to do a complete bait and switch, but surprising your readers can be a good thing. 3. Finally, be careful about exposition. Used well, it can draw your readers into your world and get them excited about things like history, magic, and politics. Used poorly, it may just take them out of the story. Characters. There is a lot to say about the characters in this show, but I want to start with kind of an unusual aspect of our protagonist, the static MC. TOG makes a pretty bold move when it comes to its protagonist, in that Bam is essentially a static character for all 13 episodes. For a little context, there's a theory that there are basically two kinds of characters, dynamic and static. We're used to seeing protagonists who are dynamic characters, people who change in some significant way over the course of the narrative. And when I say change, I mean like deep psychological change. Something about the character's view of the world or of themselves is radically different at the end of the story compared to the beginning. Static characters are the opposite. Like the name implies, they're characters who don't change in any meaningful way over the course of the story. Who they are at the beginning is basically who they are at the end. This might sound like a bad thing, but it can actually be really effective for supporting characters like mentors or sidekicks, whose purpose is to provide something to the main character going through the change, rather than changing themselves. Making your main character static is a bit of a gamble because, as I mentioned, we're really more used to seeing characters who change. And of course, if your static MC is made up of traits that people don't like and they never change, that could be a problem. Bob is an interesting case because while he learns a lot of new things and meets a lot of new people, nothing really intrinsic about who he is changes by the end of the series. This is probably because while the inciting incident for the story is Rachel leaving for the tower and Bam following her, the inciting incident for Bam's character development is actually Rachel's betrayal at the very end of the season. This means that the traits we see in Bam at the beginning of the season are still his real defining traits at the end of the season. There are three main ones. Devotion. When we first meet Bam, he's desperately devoted to Rachel and terrified of her leaving him behind. One of the first things we see him do is to throw himself headlong into the dangerous first floor test in order to maybe, possibly get the chance to see her again. And she's pretty much always on his mind, like to an alarming degree. That's probably because Bam's entire understanding of the world and his concept of himself is tied up in Rachel and her place in his life. So while other people might not quite understand his obsessive devotion, it's still clear that that devotion is a driving factor in his actions in the tower, from the very opening of the season right up until the end of the last episode. Bravery. A lot of characters comment on the fact that Baum is kind of weak and useless. His heart's in the right place, but he knows next to nothing about the tower, and even though he gets a powerful weapon pretty early on, he's mostly just hanging on to it until he can return it to the person who gave it to him. That said, from the beginning, we see this guy running toward danger rather than away from it. Hedon, the first floor test administrator, basically tells Baum that the first test will absolutely get him killed. And rather than back off, Baum jumps right in, even before he gets the weapon I mentioned. I suppose this could also be called stupidity. There's a thin line between that and bravery. Anyway, it becomes clear that what makes Baum brave isn't that he's the strongest, or the smartest, or the most skilled. In fact, he's brave specifically because he isn't those things, and he still does what he thinks needs to be done. Going through what he goes through in these 13 episodes doesn't change that. It's just how he's always been, as far as we know. Kindness. Finally, Baum is, as the kids say, a total cinnamon roll. He's cute, he's polite, he's self-effacing, and he's always looking for ways to help the people around him. While pretty much every other character in the story uses some amount of duplicity or violence to get what they want, Baum is just, genuinely a nice guy. In part, this is due to his naivete. He has no memory of anything other than his time with Rachel, so he doesn't really understand or have experience with things like conflict or cruelty. This gives him a sort of childlike innocence that people either find charming or annoying. Also, because he's spent so much time being lonely, he has a lot of empathy for other people and is always looking for ways to bring them together. He's frequently being reminded that the regulars are supposed to be competing with each other to pass the tests and climb the tower, but Baum clearly still sees everyone as potential friend material. Making change, or everything is Baum's fault. I'm going into some detail here about specific aspects of Baum's character to set up a point. Baum may be static, but the characters around him aren't. And this is what makes this writing tactic so interesting, because even if people aren't necessarily won over by Baum or any of the traits I just described, they might be won over by the way he affects the people around him. And boy does he affect the people around him. Kun. Okay, so remember how I said that shonen anime often has a trio that includes the protagonists and two other characters with very different personalities? Kun is trio member number 2, and he's about as different from Baum as you can get personality-wise. Kun is clever, manipulative, and extremely well-versed in the politics of the tower, probably because he's from one of the 10 families, who are basically the nobles in this world. He's usually the smartest person in the room, and he definitely knows it. When they meet during the second test, Kun helps Baum primarily because he's curious about Baum's weapon, not because of any particularly altruistic motive. And even as he begins to see that there's something very unusual about Baum, Kun's actions have more to do with trying to solve the puzzle rather than genuinely wanting to help another person. So I'm sure it comes as absolutely no surprise that he ends up becoming one of Baum's closest and most devoted friends. Traumatic backstory. As is the case with many an aloof smartass, Kun's character progression is rooted in a complicated and traumatic backstory. While we don't have all the details yet, and there are some differences in the anime versus the manhwa, the story basically goes something like this. Kun's family, like all of the 10 great families, is constantly working to have one or more of their members become a princess of Jihad. These women are powerful warriors who serve the king of the tower, and becoming one is a really big deal. In Kun's case, the expectation was that his sister would become the next princess. However, for reasons that are still a little unclear, Kun helped his half-sister Maria become princess instead. Since this was very much not what was supposed to happen, Kun and his immediate family were kicked out of the larger family in disgrace. And Kun learned a very important lesson about never trusting anyone or showing any sign of weakness, which is, of course, exactly what every perfectionist needs to learn. Maria and Kun versus Rachel and Baum. While these events were traumatic for Kun in both versions of the story, the anime puts particular emphasis on the possibility that Maria somehow betrayed Kun, either by manipulating him into helping her or just by leaving him behind once she had what she wanted. This creates a dynamic between Kun and Maria that's somewhat similar to the dynamic between Baum and Rachel, in that these relationships seem to involve one person abandoning the other, presumably for selfish reasons. The anime is super unsubtle about this, taking every opportunity to show Kun noticing a parallel in these relationships and having that influence his actions with regard to Baum. The more Kun sees the similarities, the more he wants to protect Baum and prevent him from having to go through what Kun did. Abandonment. Then there's the clincher when it comes to Bomb's effect on Kun, and this has more to do with a specific action Bomb takes rather than a thematic parallel. By episode 10, everyone has basically given up pretending that Michelle Light, who just got injured in the last test, is somehow not Rachel, even though it's very, very clear that she is. This is a whole thing. We'll come back to it in the consequences section. The problem is that the injury Rachel sustained is severe enough that she won't be able to continue climbing the tower. Kun assumes this means that Bomb will stop trying to go up the tower as well. After all, Bomb's only interest in the tower to begin with was finding Rachel, and now he's officially done that. Because this is how things work in Kun's world, right? You get what you need out of people, and then you leave. Except that's not what happens. Instead, Bomb explains the situation to Kun and Rock, aka trio member number 3, and says he wants to help Rachel keep climbing the tower, and he wants Kun and Rock to go with him. Essentially, Bomb is breaking the cycle of abandonment, both for himself and for Kun, by openly admitting his desire to stay with all of his friends. It's both funny and kind of heartbreaking how quickly Kun latches onto it. Rock. Rock is the number 3 member of our main trio, and he is the muscle, and often the comedic relief in the anime version. I am probably not the only person to point out that Rock is criminally underdeveloped in both versions of the story, but even with that, I think he still goes through some really interesting character development over the course of his relationship with Bomb. Rock shows up at the end of episode 1 as a regular taking the second test. This test involves a group of 400 regulars trying to whittle their numbers down to 200, mostly by killing each other. So Rock is pretty well suited for it, given that he's a tough alligator guy with a big spear who is obsessed with finding interesting things to hunt. Like Kun, Rock's initial interest in Bomb is really just about the weapon he's carrying. Rock essentially tries to browbeat Bomb into fighting him, which Bomb refuses to do. When the test shifts to its second phase and our trio realize they're being forced to become a team, Rock is vehemently against it, saying he'd never become allies with his prey. Kun and Bomb basically have to trick Rock into teaming up, which of course makes him furious. But over the course of the rest of the season, we can see Rock begin to actually care about his teammates. Sure, the combination of Bomb's interesting weapon and Kun's chocolate bribes may be the main draws at first, but it doesn't take long before Rock is doing things like being good-natured about being used as a chair and jumping in to protect Bomb from other aggressive regulars on multiple occasions. Rock's argument is that Bomb is his prey, and therefore he doesn't want anyone else to hurt him. But clearly that becomes code for, this guy's actually my friend, and I don't really want to fight him, but don't tell him I said anything. This is where things get a little tricky from a writing perspective, because while it's clear that Rock becomes fond of both Kun and Bomb, it's not as clear when and how that actually happens. However, since this is a section about how Bomb affects the rest of the cast, you probably won't be surprised to know that my theory is that Rock's change of heart has a lot to do with his interactions with Bomb. By standing up to Rock during the second test and stubbornly and repeatedly refusing to fight him, Bomb throws Rock for a loop and forces him to reconsider his approach to climbing the tower. And whether it's bravery or stupidity, Bomb always acts out of respect rather than fear or aggression when it comes to Rock. Basically, Rock's relationship with Bomb is an opportunity for Rock to filter some of his aggression into helping and protecting someone. To a certain extent, this is played for laughs, like in episode 6, when Rock hovers outside the door of Bomb's room after Bomb is injured, and Kun has to tell him to come in since he's clearly worried and being a dork about admitting it. But it's also played for heartbreak when Rock ends up being one of the most vocally upset about Bomb's supposed death at the end of the season. Black turtle, blue turtle. Bomb's influence on Rock doesn't just affect their relationship, it also affects his interactions with Kun. Rock and Kun have a much more antagonistic relationship with each other than either of them do with Bomb. They're bickering and insulting each other more often than not, both because of their clashing personalities and maybe because of their functions within the trio. Kun is the brain and Rock is the brawn, so they approach nearly everything from a different starting point. During the door test in episode 3, where Kun overthinks things and nearly causes the team to fail, Rock steps in with the stop thinking and use instinct approach, which saves the day. Because he's the comic relief character, he immediately makes a big deal out of how he's now the smart one in the group. Bomb is concerned about why Kun choked, Rock not so much. But by episode 8, Rock is the one who's aggressively telling the test administrators not to underestimate Kun during the tag test. And in episode 10, Rock is the one who calls Kun out on his BS when Kun tries to hide that he's upset with the possibility that Bomb might give up climbing the tower now that he's been officially reunited with Rachel. This scene is actually even more awesome in the manhwa, where we get a lot more of Rock sort of admonishing Kun about how the whole Maria thing went down. Manhwa Rock has a seriously high level of insight, and we don't get as much of that in the anime, unfortunately. As I mentioned, the anime mostly uses Rock as comedic relief. He's gruff, he's goofy, he wants to fight all the things. But it's also clear that he becomes extremely devoted to his friends. The insults he uses for them initially, black turtle for Bomb, blue turtle for Coon, eventually become terms of endearment. Being exposed to different ways of thinking, in particular Bomb's kindness and desire to help others, really makes Rock rethink how he approaches things and become a very devoted member of our main trio. And Dorsey. Bomb also has a really big effect on people outside the main trio, so let's finish up with an example of that. Dorsey is a princess of Jihad whose main storyline has to do with her sort of rivalry with Anak, another princess who, like Bomb, is carrying around a weapon she really shouldn't have. Dorsey is charismatic, confident, and strong. She's focused on getting to the truth behind Anak, even if it means eliminating everyone who gets in her way. She's presumably also interested in climbing the tower, but most of what we see her do at first is really just antagonizing Anak, whom she says is a fake princess. A lot of Dorsey's approach to this goal and to her relationships in general has to do with, you guessed it, a tragic backstory. In episode 9, Dorsey explains that when she was little, she was taken in by one of the lesser 10 families and forced to fight against a group of other girls to become the next princess of Jihad. The not-so-subtle implication is that she ultimately killed all of the other contestants in order to win. This formed a huge part of Dorsey's outlook on life. She's here to be beautiful, and she's here to kill things to get what she wants. Also, because of everything she's been through, she really values being a princess of Jihad. That's her whole sense of identity and power. So the idea of being friends with someone like Bomb, or any of the regulars, is completely foreign to her. She sort of plays it off in episode 6 when she tells Bomb that men and women can't be friends and that as a princess of Jihad, she can't be romantically involved with anyone either. But it turns out that even she is not immune to the powers of a cinnamon roll protagonist. Friendship is magic, Bomb edition. As much as Dorsey claims she's not interested in making friends, it doesn't really take that much interaction with Bomb before she kind of starts to change her mind. We get a good inkling of this in episode 7. As one of Rachel's teammates, Dorsey has been hiding Rachel's identity for quite some time by now, per Rachel's request. But after spending time with Bomb and seeing how devoted he is to Rachel, she's having trouble understanding Rachel's motives. Rachel doesn't explain, so in irritation, Dorsey drops one of the best lines in the entire series. And yes, I'm saying this as someone who's read all 548 chapters of the currently available manhwa.
塔の頂上であなたが手に入れたいものが彼より価値あるものだと祈ってるわ。
Dorsey's got kind of a Mean Girls vibe here, but there's some weight to it. She's really starting to be concerned about what matters to Bomb. It's also worth noting that, like Coon, a lot of Dorsey's actions at this point are coming from a place of wanting to protect Bomb from any kind of negative fallout from his relationship with Rachel. She clearly thinks that Bomb is endangering himself for someone who doesn't really want him around, and she even calls him on it eventually. Not that it does any good, but it shows that she's beginning to care about other people, which is really a far cry from where she started. Friendship is magic, Anak edition. But the biggest change for Dorsey is probably the evolution of her relationship with Anak. Anak is the daughter of a princess of Jihad, and right there we've got a problem. Princesses of Jihad are not allowed to have romantic or sexual relationships, and they definitely aren't allowed to have kids. Anak's mother was ultimately found out and killed, which left Anak with her mother's weapon and a desire for revenge against everyone associated with Jihad. Initially, Dorsey sees Anak as an aberration, someone who breaks the rules and doesn't deserve the power she has. And the hatred is mutual. They nearly kill each other during a training exercise in episode 6. But afterward, things begin to change. The more time Dorsey spends with Bomb, the more she begins to value relationships with other people, which has a big impact on her decisions with regard to Anak. During the tag team test, Dorsey essentially takes out some members of her own team in order to give Anak a better chance of passing. She initially claims that she's doing it for her own sake, but during the climax, she admits that it was really about helping Anak. And toward the end of the season, when a spy from Jihad tries to get Dorsey to kill Anak and prove her loyalty, not only does Dorsey not do it, she actually teams up with Anak to fight back. This is a pretty big deal, since it shows that Dorsey is willing to be branded a traitor and potentially lose her position as a princess of Jihad. I'm not convinced Dorsey would have gone to those lengths if her friendship with Bomb hadn't taught her how important relationships with other people can be. The manhwa is actually much more blatant about this. At the moment when Dorsey is considering whether or not to kill Anak, there's a flashback to a conversation Dorsey and Bomb had about loneliness and connecting with others. This is followed by Dorsey's decision in the present to protect Anak instead of killing her. Writing takeaways on static characters. 1. Making your MC static is risky, given that most readers expect an MC who changes and grows throughout the story. 2. That said, by having a static MC, you create an unusual opportunity to focus the narrative on how the MC's personality, beliefs, and actions deeply impact the people around them. 3. This means that if the other characters and the changes they go through are compelling enough, you might be able to pull off a static protagonist, at least for individual arcs, if not the whole story. Of course, no character section in a video on Tower of God would be complete without discussing the most contentious character in the entire series. Is it finally time to talk about Rachel? Yes? Okay, buckle up, here we go. Rachel is, I don't want to say universally reviled, but not a fan favorite. I guess that's to be expected of a character who spends the entire series plotting to kill her best friend and succeeds, sort of. The fandom hate is kind of unfortunate though, because Rachel is a really interesting and at times sympathetic villain. And writing-wise, there's a lot to learn from the way she and her betrayal of Bomb are set up. The heroine. We don't really know much about Rachel's past in either the anime or the manhwa so far, except that she somehow came across Bomb when he was trapped in the cave and decided to take him under her wing. This might have been an altruistic choice on her part, but more than that, it was a choice that put her in a position of power. She became the center of someone's entire world. When Rachel decides to leave Bomb and enter the tower, she says it's because she wants to see the stars, which seems to be both literal and maybe a little figurative. She basically wants to experience a life she can't have if she stays trapped with Bomb. Her expectation seems to be that she'll go and have an adventure and Bomb will just wait for her in the dark, or possibly forget her altogether. When that very much does not happen, she becomes increasingly desperate to reach her goal. Because as we learn, the tower never wanted Rachel, it wanted Bomb. Desperation. Everything Rachel does after entering the tower comes from a place of desperation. After she balks at taking the test on the first floor, she's forced to watch in secret as Bomb passes with flying colors, and the convenient and timely gift of a really nice sword. Rachel, on the other hand, has to beg to be sent to the next floor, and she's only granted permission after she promises to kill Bomb. The details of why Hedon and others want Bomb dead are not really explained here, but basically it centers around the idea that Bomb is an irregular, which means that the tower chose him to enter as opposed to Hedon giving him permission. This makes him potentially extremely powerful and also potentially extremely dangerous. At this point, Rachel may genuinely still care about Bomb. She certainly does seem conflicted about killing him, at least in the anime version. But in the end, her desperate need to see the stars is just more important. Jealousy. Now, I'm not going to say Rachel is justified in her actions, but I do think her jealousy of Bomb is really understandable. Remember, she's always had the upper hand when it comes to this relationship. She's basically taught Bomb everything he knows, and she's pretty aware that he basically worships the ground that she walks on. Kind of a tangent here, but this is a super unhealthy and codependent relationship. Rachel kind of needs Bomb's undying adoration so that she can have any sense of self-worth, and Bomb, well...
라헬? 僕が会いたい人? 恋人か? 違う。僕は彼女のものだから。
So it's not really surprising that Rachel would flip out when she starts to realize that the power dynamic in this relationship is changing. All of this makes for a really interesting, really complicated villain. Because yes, she basically tries to kill someone who loves her, and yes, that's really bad. But she's driven to do it because she allows herself to give in to jealousy, which is a feeling that a lot of us have had. Responsibility. What really puts Rachel into villain territory is the way that she abdicates responsibility for her choices. Whereas Bomb immediately takes action upon entering the tower, even though he has no idea what's going on, Rachel backs out of Hedon's test before even trying, claiming it's unfair and too dangerous. When she gets the opportunity to climb the tower after all, Rachel relies on her teammates rather than making any effort to learn how to fight or protect herself. I guess she does get the training to become a light bearer, but she doesn't really do a whole lot with those skills, certainly not as much as we see other light bearers in the show doing. And her teammates aren't really her doing either. Ghost is a bodyguard provided by Hedon, and Endorsi is the one who chose to team up with Rachel and Ghost when it became clear that they were the only ones left at the end of the second test. Even when it comes to killing Bomb, up until the very last moment, she's hoping someone else will do the deed for her. Failing that, she hopes Bomb will make things easy on her by running away. She doesn't even consider, not killing him at this point. As much as Rachel claims she wants to actively pursue her dream of seeing the stars, she actually spends a lot more time kind of passively letting other people do the work for her. A different POV. So how can Bomb be so dedicated to this girl? Well, it's a matter of perspective. For most of this season, everything we learn about Rachel is filtered through Bomb's perspective, and because she's the most important person in his life, that skews everything we know. We see her teach him about the sky and the stars. We see her teach him about conflict and the importance of never betraying anyone. But we also know she abandoned Bomb to climb the tower. We see her hiding her identity and avoiding Bomb on the testing floor, even though he's desperate to be with her. And in the end, she lies about her injury and betrays Bomb in order to get to the next floor. Incidentally, the narrative structure here is pretty interesting. In the last episode of the season, we revisit some scenes, but now with Rachel's voiceover describing what she was thinking and feeling at that time. Her words completely change the context and give us a lot more insight into what was happening. Things that seemed kind of sweet at the time end up looking pretty creepy as Rachel continues her downward spiral. Writing takeaways on villains. 1. Mustachioed villains who chew the scenery can be fun, but it's often the more complex villains with relatable motives who really stick with your readers. 2. Showing parallels and divergences between your villain and hero can be an effective way of deepening their characterizations. For example, if they were both faced with the same choice, what decision would each make and why? 3. It can be really enlightening to consider how your villain changes depending on whose POV we're in. Their best friend probably sees them very differently than a random stranger. Using that perspective to mess with your reader's perceptions can be really effective. Consequences. Okay, so let's talk about consequences. Consequence is a big part of a story. After all, if there's no consequence, then nothing matters. Nothing has any kind of narrative weight. Even if we love our characters and never want anything bad to happen to them, if they don't fail now and then, they can't really learn anything. Which begs the question, what if no one ever fails? Too smart to lose. I'm afraid I gotta throw Kun under the bus for this one because he's the most egregious offender in this season. To be clear, it's not that Kun never fails. It's just that his failures rarely have any kind of negative fallout, and sometimes actually the whole point of the failure was to fail, so it's not even really a failure. The door test. In episode 3, Bomb, Kun, and Rock take the door test. They're given very little information about it, except that they need to open the correct door out of 12. They have 10 minutes to do it, and if they guess wrong, they die. So, no big. Kun and Bomb were actually given an additional hint earlier on, but Kun is doing his whole don't trust anyone thing and discounting it. The more he stresses out, the more it looks like they're going to fail, until Rock randomly opens a door and they learn that they could have opened any door so long as they opened one. This is basically a failure for Kun. He was so busy trying to think his way out of the test and deal with some traumatic backstory that he nearly got everyone killed. But in terms of consequences, his inaction doesn't really have any effect. I mean, because of Rock, they passed the test. Kun does seem to come out of the situation with a little more empathy for Bomb as he continues to make connections between his relationship with Maria and Bomb's relationship with Rachel, but things were kind of already headed in that direction anyway, so this isn't really a significant change. I suppose you could argue that seeing Rock come through for them in a pinch makes Kun respect him a little bit more, but there's not really any evidence of that either. Really, the most meaningful consequence here is the lesson from test administrator Han Sung-yu about how Kun needs to accept that certainty and perfectionism aren't going to help him climb the tower. And that doesn't really pay off until a spoilery thing much later in the series that I'm not going to talk about. And even that's questionable. The door test is a great scene in a lot of ways, but in terms of showing real negative consequences directly resulting from Kun's actions, not so much. The tag test. The tag test is probably Kun's most elaborate scheme of the season. But while it appears to be a failure, after all his team fails the test, that was sort of the whole point, so it's really more of a win. Because Kun and Bomb are on different teams, and because winning or losing will affect each individual's ability to pass and move on to the next floor of the tower, Kun concocts a plan to actively sabotage his own team just enough so that Bomb will be able to earn enough points to move on. The whole thing is very clever, and it's really fun to watch Kun manipulate pretty much everyone. But since the intended result was failure, and he failed, that's not really a failure, is it? Also, because Kun delivers a really over-the-top apology speech to his team that they all fall for, there's not really any significant fallout there either. To be fair, the test does result in Ho's death and Rachel's pretty significant injury, so it's not like there aren't any consequences. But those things don't really have anything to do with Kun's plan or his failure, and they probably would have happened anyway. So in terms of meaningful consequences related to Kun's actions, again, there aren't really any. That said, this whole sequence does stand out as a kind of nice subversion of viewer expectations, so there is that. The unnecessary lie. And now we come back to Rachel and what is quite possibly the most bizarre lack of consequence in this season. In episode 6, while Bomb is recovering from an injury he got while protecting Rachel, Rachel asks Kun to lie about her identity, which Kun does. And nothing happens. The whole Rachel pretending to be Michelle Light plotline doesn't really make a whole lot of sense because it doesn't really fool anyone, including Bomb, and it just sort of gets dropped after a while. We're led to think that Kun's decision to lie to Bomb about this is going to come with some sort of significant consequence based on how much we see Kun wrestling with it. He clearly doesn't trust Rachel and wants to protect Bomb even if it means creating a rift in their friendship. Except literal seconds after the scene where he lies to Bomb, we see that Bomb wasn't taken in at all by it and just wants to know why Rachel is hiding from him. And in the next scene after that, Kun has shifted gears and advises Bomb to get stronger so that Rachel will stop ignoring him and want to climb the tower together. Which, like, horrible advice, but that's beside the point. The situation in the manhwa is pretty similar, except that Bomb also has a voiceover where he literally says he knows that Kun is lying, or at least that what Rachel told him was a lie. And still, nothing comes of it. So what was the point of Kun lying about Rachel to begin with? What was the consequence? Honestly, there wasn't one. This one irks me a little bit more than the other examples because it's clearly set up to make us think there's going to be some sort of big consequence, but there isn't. There are times when subverting audience expectations is great, but this isn't one of them. This is more like making a narrative promise and not following through on it. Writing takeaways on consequences. 1. Your character's actions have to have weight, and that usually means your characters have to fail in ways that matter. 2. Yes, this includes your smart and sneaky characters. 3. Additionally, if you set up an action to have a significant consequence, you kind of need to follow through on what you promised. Conclusion. So, let's review what we've learned today, shall we? 1. Let genre be your friend. Getting clear on what people expect from your genre can provide you with both opportunities to lean into those expectations and opportunities to subvert tropes in interesting ways. 2. Exposition isn't the enemy, but it can weigh your story down if it's not used effectively. Keep an eye on those long-winded, as you know, monologues. 3. Static characters can be tricky because we're used to seeing characters change over the course of a story. But a static character can also allow you to put the spotlight on the effect they have on other characters, which can be really fun. 4. Giving your villain relatable traits, especially negative ones, can make them more complex and interesting, even if your audience still hates them. 5. Our understanding of a character is based on perception. We bring our own prejudices and experiences to the table, and so do other characters in the story. This can be a really interesting thing to play with when it comes to characterization. 6. Your characters really do need to mess up in order for their actions to have any narrative weight. And if you promise major drama as the result of a failure, it's important to follow through. Tangent. Improving your craft. Since this video is all about craft, I want to do a brief manhwa tangent. If you've read the Tower of God manhwa, you know that there's been a huge progression in the art over the past 12 years. For example, here's our main trio in Season 1, here they are in Season 2, and here they are in Season 3. Clearly, SIU learned a lot more about his craft as time went on, and that's really cool to see. I bring it up because I think as writers, we tend to have this idea that everything we create has to be totally perfect from day one. And of course, since nothing is ever perfect, we might as well give up and never share anything. But there's something really important about being able to see a creator grow and change, and I think it's really cool that we get to do that in this case. The important parts of the TOG story, the characters, the humor, the intricate plot, all of that is there from day one. It's just that the art improved over time. My point here is that it's worth it to keep creating, flaws and all, because that's the only way we can get anywhere close to mastery. And there will always be people who love what you're doing, even at your earliest learning the craft phase. You just gotta keep going and love what you do. That's all for this video. Thank you so much for watching. This is a very different format than I normally do, so please let me know in the comments what you think. If you've seen the Tower of God anime, I would be really curious to know what you think and if you found any other writing tips to take away from it. Feel free to leave some suggestions for other shows or movies you'd like to see covered in this series. I do have some other anime titles in the pipeline, but I'm happy to get non-anime suggestions as well. And if you'd like to see how I incorporate some of these lessons into my own writing, or if you just happen to like cranky empaths and magical conspiracies, you may want to check out my urban fantasy trilogy, the Compound series. The first and second books are available in ebook and paperback, and the third book is on the way. More info on that is below. Thank you so much for watching, keep writing, and I'll see you in the next video.